Right, you're listening to the Maker's Quest podcast. I am Brian Benham.
And I am Greg Porter. And today's topic is staying curious to stay creative. And when we think about staying curious, I always put it in the perspective of I always want to be learning new things. And I consider myself, as probably a lot of people listening to this podcast, consider myself a lifelong learner. I've never stopped wanting to know more about a lot of things. I think a lot of us probably watch shows like How's It Made or things of that nature because we want to know how in the hell do they make a golf ball or whatever it is. But interestingly enough, I think when we dive into some of those things that we're learning about, we find inspiration in the way that somebody else approaches a problem. And it changes the way fundamentally that we react to things or we think about things. And I'm sure, Brian, that you have several examples in your work of times that curiosity led to creativity.
Yeah, I think I've used this example on several past podcasts. But when you're into a thing, that's kind of the thing that you're really curious about and want to keep learning more and more things about. And so, one of my inspirations of someone that I try to follow a lot is David Marks in his metal patina work and some of the colors that he gets. And he teaches a course, and I've yet been able to afford time off to go take his patina course. So I've been mainly self-exploring the world of metal patinas, and through that exploration, I think, okay, well, how does he make that color? And then that makes me go research, and during that research, I generally find new colors that I didn't know could be made, like just by mixing a couple of chemicals together and fuming it in a different way, all of a sudden creates a whole new colorway. So I think that that is like one of those things that are a good example of how I use curiosity to continue to create new things and bolster my creativity.
Well, I think you're definitely onto something. I think all of us could play Mr. Wizard in the chemistry world for the rest of our lives and never find the end of what different chemicals can do to different materials, whether that's eroding the surface, whether it's changing the color, or you put this on first and then you put that on and it pickles it in a different way. Or the
Exactly.
one I see, I think I've seen you do it, Brian, is when people put different types of salt into the mix. So you have a base material, you have a chemical that you put on it, and then all of a sudden you've got some type of chloride on top of that, and it completely changes the direction in which that experiment was going.
Yeah, I think different types of salt, like sea salt versus table salt, the granule size of how it dissolves and sits on the metal does create different patterns and things. And I think I should also clarify, just for a safety note, that before you mix things together, you should do a little research just to make sure bad things aren't going to happen. So I do research stuff, and I am at a little bit of an advantage. My daughter is going to school as a chemical engineer, so she has access to some kind of computer that you can put in what you're going to mix and in the solutions that you're going to mix it, the quantities that you're going to mix it, and it'll tell you what kind of reaction to expect. It doesn't go into art of what color it will create, but it will tell you if you're going to blow yourself up or not. So if I text her what I'm thinking and she texted me back a skull and crossbones emoji or a boom emoji, I know to proceed with caution.
that's a, that's a handy person to have on speed dial. That's for certain. I know. My gosh, we won't get too deep into chemistry here, but I know a lot of people when they're trying to clean stuff, they wind up mixing, I think it's ammonia and chlorine bleach, and it produces basically like mustard gas, very dangerous stuff. And, if you do that accidentally in your garage and you have plenty of breathing air and all that, kind of stuff, you're probably going to be okay. But when it comes to some of these other concentrated chemicals, for sure, some of the acids that you can get at your local hardware store, those can be really, really tough on your lungs, and they can hide either low in the atmosphere or high in the atmosphere, and they can hang out for a long time and still be dangerous. So yes, you're absolutely right. If you're going to experiment, maybe go outside. um, but it's always good to do all your research. But along those lines, I am so in the world of architecture, we wind up doing quite a few things with the same materials over and over and over again. And we use a lot of concrete, we use a lot of steel, we use a lot of glass, and then we use finishing materials. But on the concrete side of things, I have been able to, through the work that I do, I've been able to experiment a lot with different concrete finishes, to get different concrete stainings, whether those are acid stains, whether they're chemicals that go into the mix that change the color of the concrete. But it is absolutely fascinating to see a bottle of what looks to be bright yellow acid get poured onto a slab of concrete and turn bright purple, or something along those lines, where it just completely bends your mind. Like, how did this actually work? And you find out through conversations with manufacturers and everything else that acid is reacting with some chemical that's in the concrete, and controlling the amount of that chemical in the concrete, whether it is the salts or calcium, I guess chlorides, calciums. There's one other one that we can control with the cement. So the Portland cement, the type of Portland that you put in will actually change the color, and then the aggregates will react in different ways too. But anyway, I'm kind of going down a weird tunnel there. But when you start, we're usually allowed one big test panel on a project if we're doing some kind of staining or post finishing on concrete. And it's usually fun to leave to make it in quarters and leave one of those quarters for something completely different that nobody thought of. and it always comes out with mixed results. Sometimes it's terrible, and you would never use that in a professional setting, and other times it may inform what you do on your next project. Like, oh, hey, if you mix these two things together, it actually kind of dulls the effect and makes it a little more muted, or something along those lines.
Yeah, and then you don't necessarily have to um, go by just experimenting. You can just by watching what other people do. Like one of the things that I gleamed onto on my patina process to add copper to steel uh, as a decorative element is I was watching another guy on his YouTube channel. He used a fertilizer, or like maybe it was a moss killer that he sprayed on there, and it immediately brightened up in copper, but then it immediately turned black. And I was like, well, I need to figure out how I can use that and make it stay. And what is the chemical in the fertilizer or in the whatever it was? I think it was either fertilizer or a moss killer. What that chemical was. So then I started pulling MSDS sheets to find out what the chemical list is, and I started going through each one of those chemicals to see what would happen and what would react. And so just by staying curious of like, asking questions like, what is in that that's causing that to happen? And then what's causing it to go from bright copper to black all of a sudden? And can I stop that? So just constantly asking questions is another really great way to stay curious to continue your creative journey.
Well, and I'm going to sound like the old man now, but this I think it's always good to remind ourselves we have the internet now, which is this unending amount of research that other people have done, failures and successes both. And you can learn as much from the failures as you can from the successes. And that's probably a great example, Brian. Like, I've got this thing, it looks just like I want, and then it fails and it turns black. Well, okay, let's learn from that. What's the next step? But when you're looking for, again, something to inspire your work, something to inspire creativity, that curiosity about how other people are doing things, I think, um, I'll use an example from, or an analogy from, it's a friend of a friend. I've met Dwayne Euler. We make maybe could leave a link to his website, the Euler Wu Collaborative. He's an architect out in Los Angeles, but he does phenomenal metal work. He's also a teacher at SciArc, which is an architectural school in LA. And he talks about sometimes he'll see a student struggle. And in design school, you don't ever want to solve a problem for someone, because that's the whole point of the school, right? Is to learn how to solve the problems. But he said every once in a while he can pick them up and move them 5 steps down the line, and it's going to avoid something that is a huge time suck that will keep them from learning all the stuff on the other end. And I think that's where, as creators, as makers, when we look at how other people are doing things, it can help us pick up and skip those 7 steps of having to fail, 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 fail. And maybe it takes out 5 of the 7 failures, and you're left with only 2 that you have to solve, but you build on what they've learned. And I think that's humankind, right? The stuff that we're doing now, building steel bridges, you go back to the aqueducts and all of that kind of stuff. Like, we've built on the things that we learned back in the Roman era, and we keep advancing 1 more or 2 more steps beyond every project. And I think, when I think of curiosity leading to creativity, that's, what was the last person, what was their last step, and then how can I create something different out of that and arrive at a solution to a problem, or a solution to, maybe it's not even a problem, a new thing, and having used what they've done in the past to inform that.
Yeah, I think a good example I want to point out is when we've talked in the past about how I wanted to learn how to use watercolor in my presentations to present my designs to clients, and I wanted to use watercolor in Photoshop, but I didn't know how to create watercolor in Photoshop, and my Photoshop skills were, they're not. I know I know enough of Photoshop to be dangerous with it. Let's use that common phrase. So I or search on YouTube how to create watercolors in Photoshop. And of course, there's a whole bunch of videos by a whole bunch of different creators that are all basically the same thing to show you how to use like the cloud texture to create watercolors. It's the same tutorial, different person. And it resulted in okay colors, but it wasn't phenomenal colors. And then I've stumbled upon, like, I scrolled past all the popular YouTubers because, of course, YouTube shows the popular guys first. And they've built their great following. That's great for them. But unfortunately, they're all doing the same things. But I scrolled all the way down and I found this guy. His name is Jeremy. I can't remember the name of his channel. It's like Light Ponderings or Light in Color or something like that. But he used to be a colorist for Pixar. And
Mm.
he did not show how to do a watercolor, but he explained the theory of how he uses Photoshop to create watercolor. And that like moved my Photoshop skills from being dangerous to like 10x more than where I was at, just by 2 of his videos. Like, that a little bit of knowledge just unlocked a whole new world of Photoshop for me on how to use it.
Well, and I think that's a wonderful example. I'm gonna pull another example that many people have probably heard of, but Steve Jobs. One of the reasons Apple computers had various fonts was because he audited a calligraphy class when he was he at Stanford? I can't remember what university he was at. He wound up dropping out of it and not graduating and becoming one of the wealthiest people in the world.
Right.
Um, but the way that he described it is, Apple computers would have never had these rich font options if he had never audited that class. And what does a calligraphy class have to do with an electronics nerd who's trying to build computers, right? um, I think when I start looking at connections like that, and we've discussed before on this podcast some of the chocolate and peanut butter type of things, where 2 ideas collide and become something far better than the two ideas were on their own. And I think that's a wonderful example. Calligraphy on its own is a great thing. Computers on their own are pretty cool. But when you put the two together, all of a sudden you open all these doors, either to different types of creativity in the graphic design world, or in the print industry, or whatever it was. I think, a lot of the early font users on computers were sign makers. And it's amazing. If you want some creative inspiration, just look up sign making. Just start down that rabbit hole on the internet, and you will see some of the most interesting graphic layout, creative things that you've ever seen. And I always look at guys that I respect. I mean, Jimmy DiResta is one of them. Look at Jimmy DiResta's sign making abilities. Just search his channel for signs. He does some magnificent work in signs. Everybody talks about his welding and all the other, and he does some amazing other things. Don't get me wrong. Don't take that the wrong way. But when I go back and look at his ability, his proportions, his layout, the scale of things that he does, I think a lot of that probably goes back to some early sign making that he did when he was younger. I don't know Jimmy's complete history, where he started and all those kind of things, but I think that informs a lot. And again, when we look at areas to grab inspiration from, to become to generate creativity, I think looking at things like the old masters in sign making will change the way that you address furniture, will change the way that you address car design, will change the way that you address a number of things that you might be designing.
Yeah, there was a YouTube video I was watching a while ago. I can't remember what was her, I think her name is Dammy Lee, maybe. Um, if I can find it, I'll put a link into it in the show notes. It was a great little video about how she went to Venice, and she was just deliberately creative. And as she walked through Venice, if a alleyway looked interesting, she'd just go down that alleyway. Sometimes it would be like this dead end. Sometimes it would open up into this really beautiful um, place where she could take a picture of some beautiful architecture overlooking. I don't know. Do they call it the bay? A bay there that that
I know
Venice
exactly
is
what you're
in.
talking about, but yeah.
Yeah, and so she explored Venice like that, and she just kept cataloging these views as she went through. So it's kind of like that. Be a deliberate observer of your environment as you walk around and observe things. Just take note of that and catalog it for later use. And so, back to Jimmy DiResta example, one of the signs that I saw him make is he took metal and sheet metal and bent it the shape of the letters, and then put a light inside each letter. So it was like this box letter. So for him to come up with that idea, it was because he was curious about electricity. So he knew how to solder and wire the light bulb. He was curious about metal. So he knew how to bend the light bulb or bend the metal to make the shapes. He was curious about welding and brazing to braze the edges together. He was curious about light and color of light to know what type of bulbs would look good inside that light. So all those things throughout his entire life that he collected as he went helped him create this really cool sign.
Yeah. And you bring up something interesting, Brian. And it's something that I know I have fallen victim to over the years. And it's, you get into a lot of different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't call myself a woodworker, a metal worker, a machinist, any of those things, a painter, an instrument builder. I'm not in one box. I'm in a lot of different boxes. And I think having all of those sandboxes close to one another so that you can hop from one to the next and combine them back is how you get some really interesting things to happen. And Jimmy is one of those guys. I think, I've seen him do some printmaking, leather work, welding, woodworking. And I don't want to make this whole episode about Jimmy DiResta, but I think he's a wonderful example, because when you look at YouTube, when you look at a lot of podcasts, there are people who I don't want to say they pigeonhole, but they definitely say I'm a woodworker, or I work on cars, or I'm a machinist. And sometimes they don't go outside of those bounds, but there are other guys. I follow a few guys that do plastic injection molding. There's something completely different. But in order to do plastic injection molding, you have to be a machinist, a mold maker. You have to understand plastics and resins and how they shrink and grow. Some of the guys who do injection molding are also roboticists. So they have robots that pick parts out of molds, trim them, pack them, put them in another machine for a second process. Sometimes they overmold things, so the robots have to put in the thing that's being overmolded, and that uh, art, if you want to call it that, is so multifaceted in terms of what you have to know and what you have to be an expert at, that it's fascinating. And the one thing that I don't see them do a lot of is woodwork or welding, but they do a lot of different stuff. And if you're going to plastic injection mold parts that are going to become part of another assembly, I think that's where it starts to grow. Now, a lot of the makers out there are skipping the plastic injection molding process and using 3D printers, which I think is awesome too. Totally different subject matter, but it's all to build different assemblies or different pieces and parts that are going to work in a way that maybe a metal part wouldn't work or a wood part wouldn't work. So it's a wonderful third or fourth option in a lot of cases.
So yeah, so I guess on another side tangent on staying creative with your career, I back in the day I worked for a bridge construction company, and one of the things that we were tasked to do one day was to test an engineer's theory about how to pour those barriers between the highways. So if a car hits it, if you drive down the freeway, those barriers are kind of triangle shaped and they have a certain shape to push the car back down. And those are just craned in. On his particular design, they were going to be a monolithic piece coming off the bridge. But since they're triangle shaped and he wanted to pour it in place, the weight of the concrete would push the form up off of it. So he came up with this idea to build this particular style of form that would not allow for the concrete to push it up off the ground. And this concrete truck driver, pulls up with a load full of concrete. We pour it in the form, and we're doing our thing. And at the end of the day, he's just like this old grouchy looking dude, like he's scary looking, and I'm like maybe 17, 18 years old, so I'm definitely a little intimidated by them because I'm just some dumb kid just hired to shovel concrete into the form, right? And he points at me, he's like, "Hey, you kid, come here." And I was like, okay. So I go over there and he's like, "Hey, you look like you work hard. I want you to come over and help me build my deck this weekend if you're interested. Pay you a couple $100." And so I didn't know what to expect. Like, is he going to like bury me in his backyard, or am I going to make a couple $100? But I go over to his house, and as soon as I pull down the street, I know exactly which house his is, because the front of his house had all kinds of decorative concrete. The sidewalk, he had cut out the sidewalk that the city poured and poured his own stamped concrete in the sidewalk. All the paths throughout his garden, and his garden had all these different raised beds with all these different types of stamped concrete. Like, he had practiced stamping different techniques and different stains and different colorations throughout his entire yard. And what he had told me is that every time he had leftover concrete, a lot of guys, they just dump it out on the ground somewhere, wherever the contractor says, "Hey, go dump it." But he would bring it home and he would use it to practice, because he wanted to start his own decorative concrete business someday. And so his whole yard was this whole thing of him just being curious and playing with concrete.
I that is a wonderful example of what you can do. I I talk a lot, gosh, especially to the young people I work with. I know I say that all the time, but I talk a lot about that 1%. If you can put in 1% per day to make yourself better at something, I don't care what it is. If it's verbal skills, if it's reading books, if it's going out in the shop and doing something different that you've never done before. Or if you're learning to weld, weld, you know, 30 minutes every day, and you'll be amazed in a couple months how good you are at that skill, fill in the blank. And that's a perfect example of, hey, every day I'm driving these concrete trucks back with a quarter of a yard. I could use that to make myself better, or to push some ideas that I've had. And, at what cost, right? That cost that guy fuel probably to get from point
Yeah.
A to point B. And that's it. And back to our topic, curiosity. There's an unending, and I know other makers out there are this way. There's an unending pile of things that I've taken apart in my life with no intent to put back together. Not a, hey, I'm going to fix this, or I'm going to make this better. It's just, this doesn't work anymore, but I'm going to take it apart to understand how they did what they did. The famous one that a lot of people do is toasters. Toasters are fascinating. The mechanism that pops, that times the toast and pops it up. There's several variations of what that is, but to see it in action is just fascinating. If you can get your hands on an old 50s or 60s toasters, they're much more interesting than the ones they're making today. But microwave ovens are another favorite of mine. It's just a huge transformer with some contactors inside of it, but they're fascinating to take apart, to see the latching mechanisms that interlock to make sure that you don't microwave your hand by sticking it in there and not closing the door, things of that nature. But the thing that I would say is a great thing to do. As makers, we're surrounded by things that are manufactured, and really digging down and paying attention. I look at things. You look at the material something's made out of. You look at the color that it winds up being, but then look hard at the textures that are added to different parts for different reasons, whether that's knurling, sandblasting, sanding, tumbling, if it's a crackle finish for one reason or another. I mean, sometimes they're aesthetic, but a lot of times there's a tactile feedback that needs to happen. And back to injection molding, look at some of your tools. The thing that I would say is cordless screwdrivers or cordless drills are fascinating. Just really study how they mold that tool, how they overmold that tool, the clicks and the tactile feedback that you get when you hit the buttons or click switches or whatever those things are. That type of curiosity, really studying a thing, an object that somebody has put a ton of time into making, will inform your future projects to a level that most people don't ever get to. Kyle Toth is a great example of somebody who adds interesting texture to his work. And he's a woodworker, right? He's a not necessarily a wood turner. He does a lot of turnings, but he makes furniture and he does other things. But he will go in and add texture to certain pieces of his work. And it's extraordinarily tedious, but it separates his work from everybody else's.
Is he the guy that does the leopard print carvings?
He
That's
is.
that's the texture. Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
some crazy cool stuff.
it is. And, I would look at some of his turnings as well. The size of his turnings is insane. Like that guy, I'm sure there are other people out there turning pieces just as big, but he's doing these segmented turnings that are just enormous. I don't know how many glue ups he goes through. It's got to be, in some cases, hundreds of glue ups to get the pieces formed to make the final shape. But just insane cool work.
Yeah. So kind of stepping back a little bit to your engineering or taking things apart, I think that's how a lot of makers kind of got started and interested in making, is taking things apart. I certainly took my share of things apart, not always with the best permission from my father. I remember one time I took the chainsaw apart because I wanted to know how it worked, and then he's talking about one night at dinner with my mom that he's going to clean up the yard this weekend. So I knew he's going to be wanting his chainsaw to cut up all those branches. So I frantically putting that chainsaw back together and hoping that it will start. But yeah, so anyways, so yeah, and then I think that's just how you learn how things work, and then you're able to diagnose if something goes awry. So if we kind of take that shift to using creativity or being curious to problem solving, recently with all this rain here in Colorado, we had a huge thunderstorm that rolled through and it flooded the side of my house where the septic tank is at. And we had sewage water backing up into the basement.
Not fun.
So yeah, all night I was with my shop vac sucking it up, pouring it out the window, sucking it up, pouring it out the window all night long until we were able to get a pump truck out to pump the tank out. But me being curious when I first moved into this house, I wanted to know how a septic system works. So I kind of went and investigated it and I took the lids off of all the different things. And there's some different control things. And I realized just from my curiosity that there were these valves that came from the wheat field uh, that was allowing water to flow back into the tank. So once I shut those valves off, it slowed the amount of water coming into my basement to a manageable level. And had I not been curious when we moved in to know that those valves are there, my basement would be a huge mess right now.
Well, I think that's a great lesson too, is that, most of the things out there, a lot of people are afraid to lift lids and look in things and turn knobs because they think they're going to upset the balance of of the earth or something. I don't know what it is, but most of the systems that we have, whether it's our electrical system, our heating system, our plumbing system in our houses, are fairly simple systems. There's not a lot complicated in there. Some of the controls are sometimes complicated, but the pieces of equipment are just valves and knobs and buttons and contactors and things of that nature. And you know, being curious about them again, I think can lead to a number of things that change the way that you work or change the way that you solve problems and lead to things. Um, I think back to, I mean, the simple valve in our toilets, right? You flush the toilet, the float goes down, and at a certain point, it turns on the water. And then when it floats up to the top, at a certain point, it trips and stops the water, right? So there's a range, and it works just like a compressor or anything else, where there's an in and an out range. And thinking back to Kansas City and the house we had there, we were going to start collecting rainwater and water our grass with rainwater because they get a fair amount of precipitation in that area. And looking at, well, how do you do that without overflowing tanks and this, that, and the other thing? And I had a full design for a diverter valve that would work just like a toilet. So when you have your tank and it gets to a certain point, when it gets low enough, that diverter valve says, okay, any rainwater that's coming off of the roof is going to go into the tank. Then when it fills up to a certain level, now instead of overflowing that tank and inundating your foundation or whatever, it's going to divert and go into the downspout that was meant to kick water away from your house. And I don't know, there's so many examples of little systems like that that we have every day. We walk past them every day in our house, and they can be extraordinarily useful if you're designing something different or something new, even though you may not think that it applies.
Yeah, and even the more complex system, I over the years I've kind of come to this realization that I no longer need to call a professional to come fix something or install something or do something for me, especially with the internet, because that information for that professional to learn to become a professional is out there somewhere. I just have to
Yeah.
find it and read it and then go be curious enough to take the thing apart to see how it works to understand it. And then I can install it myself. And a perfect example of that is my well. We live out in a rural area. I'm on a private well. I have a well pump, and there's two basic styles of well pumps. There's a well pump that pumps it up to a tank that's usually in your rafters or someplace high. And it's got a bladder in it to keep a little pressure on it. So when you turn your water on, gravity in that little bladder helps push water into your sink or your toilet or whatever you're filling. Or what I have is a stage pump. So it has a detector on it. So when you turn the shower on, it knows, okay, this it needs this much volume of water from the sensors. So it ramps up the pump. Then if somebody flushes the toilet, it knows like, oh, hey, someone flushed the toilet. We need a lot more water, and it speeds up the pump. Well, the control box that senses all that stuff went bad, and I called someone to come out and repair it. And this person was supposed to be a professional, and they installed a new box and they left. And we turned on the water. Okay, yeah, I got water. Well, when you turn on the shower and then someone flushes the toilet, all hell broke loose, and it would drop the volume of water, and then it would speed up to this crazy high pressure. Like this thing could not control the box. And so I called the guy, and he's like, oh, well, it's going to be another X amount of dollars for me to come out and diagnose it. And I was like, well, I'm not paying that, because I think, one, you're ripping me off because you don't know what you're doing. And two, I'm going to figure this out myself. And what it needed was to be programmed to talk to the pump. And you had to have a special tool to program it to talk to the pump. And he didn't have that special tool. And so he just was like, oh, yeah, it worked, and got out of there, and, basically tried to screw me. So I found someone in my area that had that special tool, and I told them what happened. I'm like, look, I think I got ripped off by this guy. I don't want to spend a bunch of money. Can I just borrow your tool? And the guy gave me his tool, and this little programmer tool, and I was able to program the pump myself. And then after I got water running and a little more research, I realized I can just order that thing on Amazon. Like I don't, so like you just need to, unfortunately, one, you don't have water and your wife's looking at you like, hey, I want to take a shower before I go to work. You don't necessarily always have time to research all those things. But now that I've experienced that, if it happens again, I could just order next day off of Amazon the parts that I need, and I'm back up and running.
I, that's a great lesson. I think, again, being curious about things is a wonderful way to lead to, number one, educating ourselves, right? Like, how does this work? And generally, like we shared earlier, a lot of these things aren't that complicated. They just take a little time. But the thing that I would share is, in a lot of situations, we have more time than we have money. And we are, since my job and your job isn't to go out and repair things or do certain things for people, you can, and some people call it tinkering, you can tinker at something for a while. But the way I like to say it is, you can tweak things. You can spend the time to make something perfect and to really dial it in. And the example that I would use is, I've painted cars before, and several things that require an insane amount of time. And if you're going to pay someone to repaint a car for you, really repaint a car, like restoration level, paint a car, you're probably upwards of 20,000, maybe going into the $30,000 range for someone to do that, wet sand it, buff it, and do all the things to make that finish as good as it can be. As a home gamer, so to speak, you can buy the tools to paint a car for a couple $100. Like a really high-end spray gun might cost you $800 compared to $30,000 for somebody to paint your car. It becomes a pretty affordable tool to buy if you're staring down the barrel. Now, the paint itself is probably going to cost a fair amount of money too, don't get me wrong, and buffers and that sort of thing. But you can spend an insane amount of, you can pay someone to do paint correction. Every paint job needs paint correction. I don't care who does it. There's always going to be a little sag here, dust nibs, or something along those lines that can use correction. And then polishing out a paint job, it doesn't matter if it needs correction or not. It needs to be polished out if it's going to be as good as it can be. But it's all time. The skills really aren't that dramatic. You need to be able to do this in a flat manner over the entire surface of a vehicle. And you can take a paint job from looking like it came out of a garage to looking like it's ready, to win a car show. And all it is time and, a few little sandpaper and some polish and some other things here and there. But you can get darn near the same result that the $30,000 guy might have. And the reality is he doesn't have time to mess with it. When it's painted, he's got to get it out of his shop because he's got 5 more sitting behind it. And so there might be some minor imperfections that he's not going to get to anyway. And I think that's a great lesson with being curious, is once you figure out sort of the micro set of skills that it's going to take to do something, doing it on a larger scale is just increasing the area in which you're working. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And the plumbing example is exactly that. It's not probably that hard. There's some textbook somewhere, or there's some class that the guy went to, or those types of people go to learn that stuff. And again, if you're dealing with pressures in your house, those guys charge by the hour. They're trying to get out of there before their hour's up or whatever else. And if there's, some really dialed in types of things, if you have that programmer, you're going to get it exactly how you want it. And it's going to be perfect, where, trying to call somebody back and forth 3 or 4 times to get it squared away is going to be cost prohibitive.
Yeah, yeah. So one thing I always like tell myself when I screw something up and it's going to cost me some money is I didn't go to college to learn how to be an artist or be a woodworker. I didn't go to a trade school to learn how to be a woodworker. I just went out there and started doing it because I liked doing it and I was curious about it. So when I screw up, that's like my college tuition, right? Like when I went
Yeah.
from being a hobbyist to a professional woodworker, and I went from using like hobby type of finishes to a spray booth, my first gallon of spray finish, I basically used that gallon. That cost of that gallon was just screwing up, trying to figure out how to set the gun up, how to clean it, how much to thin it, right, and just practicing it. So that $70 gallon was my tuition to learn how to spray finish.
Well, another great lesson there is, if you're learning to spray finish or learning to do anything, I don't care what it is, sweating pipes, uh, hooking up electrical outlets, whatever it is, there's always a very inexpensive practice material to try your hand on. And we've probably mentioned this before on the podcast, but don't learn finishing on a piece of furniture that you've spent 400 hours sanding and getting perfect. Don't use that as your practice piece. Set it aside. Go buy yourself, a pile of pine 1x6s and cut them into 12-inch long pieces and spray your finish. And when you can get a piece of pine looking like it belongs in a museum, then you're ready for the $10,000 walnut and fill in the blank exotic wood table that you've got sitting off to the side that needs to be finished.
To kind of piggyback on your don't use your $400 400-hour piece to practice finishing on, but don't buy necessarily the cheap materials, because those cheap
True.
materials, like if you buy a cheap gallon of finish, that might not spray as smoothly as the higher end stuff. There's a reason why the higher end stuff sprays better. And also, like the gun, if you buy a cheap gun, it's not going to perform as well. You're not going to get as good of a finish as you can. So you got to find that balance of like, okay, I'm going to use these cheap practice pieces, but I'm still going to use the high performance finish to practice with. So that way I know and get a feel with it. And then I think another good thing to iterate on, or to think about, is never think that you've mastered that. Like right now, I have a order for 16 tables for a restaurant. And so I'm spending a lot of time in the spray booth spraying bottoms and tops. I know some people don't always spray the bottom of their tables. I do, because when you got to peel that gum off, you'll thank me for spraying the bottom too. But so I have bottoms and tops of 16 tables of spray, and I'm about halfway through. And my technique from the first table I sprayed to the table I sprayed now is even more refined. And I thought like the first table, I was like, yeah, I know what I'm doing. Like I've sprayed hundreds of tops before, but now that I'm spraying them in succession every day, like all day long, spraying, um, there's a whole nother level of dialing in stuff that I didn't even realize was there.
I'll share. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna kick his name out there because I haven't asked him about it. But one of my good buddies who has a YouTube channel, he paints cars and does some custom work. And anyway, I think the world of him. One of his jobs was to paint car mirrors in a factory, and they sprayed out of a pressure pot. I can't remember how many gallons of paint, if it was a single gallon or like a 3 or 4 gallon pressure pot. And so, I mean, literally, they would just spray for hours on end these mirrors, and they would come through. I don't know if it was Buick mirrors or something along those lines. It was American car mirrors. And he talked about, we talked one time, and he talked about the difference in painting when you're, doing motorcycle parts or fenders or whatever in your garage, and you think you're pretty good, and then you go to a factory and that line is humming along, and you got to be knocking these mirrors out. And by the way, you get one chance to get it perfect. Like it's got to be one shot,
Or
no
it moves
runs, no
on.
drips. And it's just a completely different level. But once you've done that, now you've met, like, you can paint anything. If you can paint these crazy shaped mirrors and not get drips and runs, and get it coated evenly along the way, like all of a sudden there's a different level. But I'll piggyback on your comment as well. I will say, when it comes to the material that you're spraying, if you're going to practice, you have to practice with the good stuff. There's no doubt about it. But I will add this tip. When I was learning to use the spray gun, so I went from a siphon feed, which the paint is in a can on the bottom and it comes out the top. Those are higher pressure paint guns, right? So a lot of overspray in those spray guns. I think they sprayed at like 60 or 80 pounds of pressure. The entire market moved to a high volume, low pressure gun. So it's a gravity feed where the paint's on the top, but the pressures are more like 18 psi, something like that. I think I spray between 18 and 22, somewhere in there. When I changed guns like that, I was completely screwed up. I started spraying expensive material on test panels and couldn't get the damn thing dialed in. And I realized what I needed to do was stop using paint for a minute and understand how to control the gun itself, just the gun. And I can't tell you how many quarts of water I sprayed through my expensive spray guns, which I was nervous. I thought, gosh, is this going to corrode it? And it's like, no, you know what? All these parts are chromed. They're meant to be cleaned and stuck in solvent. They're also good for waterborne paints, whatever. But I painted entire cars with water over and over and over again till the atomization was good, the spray patterns were good, and everything. If you can get water, by the way, if you're painting a car or painting furniture or anything else, if you can get water to lay down and not drip and run, you'll know exactly how to paint with no problems. But then, like I said, once I got to a point where I was very comfortable with fan pattern and material flow, pressures, and all those kind of things, then I switched back to using, again, the good material. And I will share, whether it's opaque finish that has color in it or whether it's clear finish, the more you pay for those finishes. Everybody thinks that, well, if I use this clear finish versus that clear finish, it's going to cost me twice as much because the price per gallon is twice as much. Generally, the stuff that's more expensive will actually cover more surface area. You will get more yield out of more expensive paint. It seems counterintuitive, but a quart of very expensive paint generally goes much further than a quart of the less expensive paint. So just kind of a lesson that I've learned the hard way: buy the expensive line.
Yeah, that
I don't
goes
know if you've
for,
learned the same thing.
well, that goes, I don't spray a lot of paint, but like house paint, that's the same thing. Like if you're just brushing your wall or whatever, The thinner material you got to put two coats on. The more expensive stuff you could do it pretty much in one coat. But back to staying curious,
Yeah.
um when you're adjusting your gun, it's always like, okay, what you got to be curious enough to ask yourself questions like, okay, what happens if I increase the air pressure, and then observe what's happening and then react to that. Observe what happens if I increase the fluid, and observe what's happening. Am I getting orange peel? How do I get rid of orange peel? If I increase my pressure, does that get rid of the orange peel or does it make it worse? And that just staying curious with your questions and observing what happens.
Yeah, I think that's the key to fighting through any new process is 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 doing the process, then asking, being very critical of your work. Did I lay down a weld bead that's perfectly even all the way along? If the answer is no, then why? Well, I might have hesitated here. And if you can't sort it out while you're actually doing that process, again, it could be running a hand plane along a board. I'm trying to get two boards to join with a hand plane, but I'm getting lumps or bumps. Put your video camera up, videotape yourself, or video record. We don't use tape anymore. Video record yourself doing it. And I can tell you, back to learning to paint cars. I videoed myself painting the same car probably 10 times, watching, did you miss a spot? How did you move when you went from the top of the fender where you're going the entire length of the car to in between the two wheels where the door is? Are you keeping the same pace? Like if you count how many feet you're painting per second, are you keeping the same pace, or are you putting on more paint or less paint? And are you keeping your overlaps the same? Same with welding. If you can, put your camera up and watch yourself running a weld bead, you'll see your hands either change angle, change speeds. Something will be different when your weld doesn't look good. And if you can identify those, you can correct them. And then all of a sudden you'll be, the perfect stack of dimes, or however you want to say it. You'll do it over and over again. I still suffer from some of those things because I don't practice enough. And when I say I don't practice, I don't do it enough. But once I get into welding for an hour or so, it all comes back, and you start noticing, oh yeah, you're rushing a little bit on the start of your weld or on the end of your weld, or as you're changing positions to, if you're running a weld that's several inches long, you've got to change positions throughout the weld. And, should I back off, stop, and then restart, or, what's the answer?
Yeah,
Same could be said for getting square cuts or anything else.
yeah, that videotaping yourself is probably the best tip out of this whole episode of podcasting, because that is something that I do now just because I have a YouTube channel. But there's things that I've noticed about what I do in the shop that I'm like, what the hell? Like, back to spray finishing again. A gravity feed cup doesn't come, it's not uh parallel with the it's kinked back, so that way when you are spraying like a tabletop or something, the fluid is still draining towards the needle, so it's not level. But I always had trouble with like an uneven spray pattern, and I didn't realize this until I was editing a video for YouTube, that I was making the cup level to my piece, not the tip. Just like, just being just dumb, not even thinking about it. Like, I'm going to hold the gun level. Yeah. Cause then I'm leveling the cup, not the tip. And I would have never noticed that had I not videotaped myself.
Yeah, I think that's a common thing now that you see. And, I don't care what you're doing, if you're trying to achieve high performance in anything, race car drivers, golfers, skiers, runners, they're constantly looking at video recordings of themselves and analyzing it. Where's your body center line? Is it ahead of, if you're golfing, is it ahead of you striking a ball? Is it behind, or is it right in the middle where your center of gravity is over the ball and you're going to strike it and it's going to go straight every time? As makers, we can make ourselves high performance makers as well. And I do the same thing, Brian. I record a lot of the things that I build in my garage. I don't always edit them and put them out as videos, sometimes because the content just isn't any good. And that happens a lot for me. And it's maybe inattention or other things, where either I don't capture something in the way that the story needs to be told, or the footage just doesn't work. But I still watch those things back, and I look at, how am I moving around the shop? How is the material moving from point A to point B? Am I being fastidious about how my process, am I touching the same thing 10 times, or am I touching it once or twice? And a lot of the stuff that I do in my shop now is production type work, because I do have, a guitar tool company. We are selling other things where I have to do high volumes of things, thousands of parts sometimes. And I will video record. I have a security camera in my garage, and I can go back on that security camera and watch it in time lapse and see the pattern of how I'm moving things around the shop. And that will tell me, you're wasting a ton of time walking from point A to point B 1,000 times, because that may be how many parts I'm working on. And if I can eliminate one step times 1,000, that results in, hey, maybe I'll be able to do something fun on the weekend instead of sitting and drilling 5,000 holes, which some of my weekends are like that. But I think we can, again, just being curious about things. I think being creative in our process is just as important as being creative in the things that we make, because again, the more efficient we can make our processes, the more time we have to either experiment more, create more, or take time away and de-stress a little bit. I think a lot of us makers are under the gun. We have deadlines, we have things that need to be done. You've got a ton of tables that you're doing for one restaurant. If you could hit the fast forward button and get to the end of that, I guarantee you would. And
Absolutely.
right, there's a lot of stress with that.
Yeah.
They have to be delivered, they have to be, done well. So just looking at your process for working, and trying to figure out, how can I make my processes better as a maker, as a designer, as a builder of things.
Okay, so Greg, I think we need to step back a little bit and talk a little bit more about skyscraper guitar tools.
Oh yeah.
Uh, so part of problem solving, that was kind of what jump started your tool business. Do you have a good example of creativity that are using creative processes to suss out your design changes and build off your designs?
Absolutely. I'm trying to think of one in particular, but it's that curiosity that's driven that entire company. I'll be the first to say, there are other guitar tool companies out there. Some of them have been around for damn near a century now at this point, and a lot of them are doing things the same way that they did them when they started 60, 70, 80 years ago. And a lot of the tools look exactly as they have throughout history. And there's nothing wrong with that. They've worked, but some of them have been refined. But definitely, when I got into guitar tool making, which is kind of an odd place to be, right? There's not a lot of those out there. Doesn't seem like there would be a lot of things. But I started looking at, what are people doing in the repair world or in the building world of guitars, that takes a lot of time, is difficult to do, but could maybe be made faster, easier, more efficient, more accurate, if they just had a tool that would help. And that was where the whole company started. Is I was setting up my Floyd Rose equipped guitar, which it's a floating tremolo. There's a knife edge, there's springs, and there's tensions and all kinds of crazy stuff. I've probably talked about it on this podcast before, but it's so difficult to work on those guitars. I mean, you're talking, just to change strings might take you an hour, and that should be a 10-minute exercise. And so my question was, can we eliminate a portion of that hour? How much of that hour can I eliminate? And that led to my trim wedge blocks, is the name that they go by. But it's just a stair step block that allows you to take the spring action out of the equation and make everything a rigid system. Then you can do your entire setup, remove it, and then add the spring tension in to balance. And you're balancing against something that was set up in a rigid situation. So it's very simple. And it took an hour-long process down to, it takes me maybe 10 minutes to change a set of strings on one of those guitars now. Well, the average person in their basement, home gamer, guitar player, it's not going to be a big deal. Like if they take an hour to change a set of strings, it's no big deal. But there are guys out on tour that are working for guitar players that might have 10 guitars that have these Floyd Rose bridges on them. And most guitar techs change strings every other day on instruments that are played in live shows. So 5 of these guitars every day that these guys have to work on. And you're looking at, that might take 5 hours if you don't have the right tool to make that go. Well, that's an insane amount of time to spend every single day servicing these guitars. But for sure, looking at instrument building very critically, like what are the really, really difficult things in instrument building to get right. And when I say that, this is the chisel skill that takes 5 years to develop to get perfect, right? That's the question. Like where does that happen in guitar building, and how can I start to not necessarily eliminate the need for that skill, but reduce it significantly? I think guitar building, as with furniture building and other things, you have to possess a high level of skill to execute things that are complex and difficult. Once you've done that, you open the door for, okay, if I make this section of that skill not necessary, or you don't have to apply it to this part, then I can use my highly developed set of skills over here and make an even more interesting instrument. So it's giving you back time to make something that is, more interesting or more intricate. I don't know. And, some people will tell you, well, these things are overly done, right? There's too much here, the gilded lily, so to speak. But I think there's also a search as a designer to be able to make anything that's in your head. Well, if it takes you 7,000 hours to do something that's in your head, you're never going to get there. And again, looking at skyscraper guitars and some of the tools we make, and some of the tools we have in development that I can't talk about yet, they are to do exactly that: eliminate some of those very difficult, very precision type things that take a long time to develop, so that guitar makers can stop spending their time there and start spending their time on other things that would add value to their instruments, either because of the way they look or the way they perform.
Yeah. So take a little tangent. When you said the hobbyist guitar player, the guy in his basement, may not be interested in your product, I think they would very much be interested in your product. Just as an example, my saxophone, when it's in the case, it won't ever get played because I think, oh, I want to
Yeah.
play it, but oh, I got to take it out of the case. I got to put 3 pieces together before I can play it. But that's like a barrier to entry for my brain for some reason. But if it's just sitting there and all I got to do is pick it up,
Mhm.
then I'm rocking and rolling. So the guy that just wants to quickly change out his guitar string so he can get back to jamming in his basement, I think would totally be interested in that, because that's removing a barrier to new strings, to moving a barrier to playing the instrument.
Well, and I'll share, Brian. I don't talk about this a whole lot because it always feels like a little altruistic. I don't know if that's the right word to use there, but philosophically, the reason that I make tools for people who repair and build guitars, and people who play guitars too, not just luthiers, but players as well, is I think it's much more important for people to make music than it is to spend time working on instruments. And anything I can do, I think the world benefits greatly from creative endeavors, whether that's art that's hanging on the wall, whether that's music that you hear, whether it's performances that you go and see. There's a reason those things have stood the test of time, and it's because they're important for us as human beings to experience, to push our limits of what we understand the human body can do, but to also push our senses in a way, whether that's feeling emotions through hearing music or other things of that nature. And a lot of people walk away from playing instruments because of the barrier to entry in terms of difficult, technical difficulty. You have to understand what music is, what the notes are, what rhythm is. There's a lot of those things, but the physical barriers as well. If you're a saxophone player, it's finger dexterity. If you're a piano player, it's dexterity, but sometimes it's strength too. If you're really trying to lay into a piano that's hard to play, it fights you. Guitars are much the same way. You'll see a lot of people quit playing guitar because of the finger pain that they go through. And that finger pain isn't because guitars cause pain, it's because poorly set up guitars, poorly built guitars make it very painful to play. I work on a lot of instruments for people, and they bring them in here. And I'm like, I don't understand how you could even play this. Like, this is so painful to play. And a lot of people give up that their pursuit of music because the instruments are hard to play. And I think the world is probably lost out on a lot of creative musicians that gave up their pursuit because of that. So that's why I do what I do at Skyscraper Guitars. Yes, there's the itch that I have to scratch as a designer, but the reason I apply that to guitars specifically is because I think the world could benefit from more guitar players, more musicians, more creative people.
Yeah, more joy. How much joy of the world has been lost because of a bad playing guitar? Because I know that I could be in a terrible mood, stupid, frustrated, just like how like I don't know if you get like this, but my brain, like, sometimes I get so frustrated, I'm angry, and I can't break myself out of it. Like, it's just the whole day is just a loss to me. But I can sit down and play for a little while, and all that just goes away, and then I'm ready to go back to work.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes we got to live in the moment, and our brains don't want us to do that.
Yeah.
And in music, it's that old saying, right? Music soothes even the most savage of beasts. And it does. I think music talks to there's a reason. uh we're not the only species that's musical, right? You hear birds, you hear whales, you hear, there's a number of different animals on the planet that are very musical, and some that you wouldn't expect. um there's a reason for it, and it's almost like our own little reset button, a reboot. You put on some good music, and I don't care if it's heavy metal, if that's your thing, or if it's classical or opera, or jazz or pop or hip hop, or whatever it is. There, that stuff speaks to us, and it's very important. I know we're way off topic, but even at that, I think a challenge that I would give a lot of people is to pick a different kind of music and just put on, iTunes or Spotify or something on a channel that you wouldn't normally listen to. And you may hate 80% or 90% or 95% of what you hear, but every once in a while you hear that one little tune and it's like, wait a minute, that one's good. I got something out of that. And it might be a lyric, it might be the way the song was arranged, or something, the drum beat, something behind it. And you look at exactly what we're talking about. A lot of hip hop music samples music from other genres, other times, and puts a new spin on it. And that's exactly what it is. Those guys would never make the music that they're making if they weren't curious about other types of music and bringing that curiosity into their genre and applying it to hip hop.
Yeah, and then also, just to piggyback off the music, also dance, like how it makes you feel. Like,
Yeah.
there is, I'm sure if you've been on Instagram lately, you've heard the song of the girl that's singing that she's from outer space. She has evolution in her veins. That song, it's like on everybody's everybody's using that on their tracks now. But if you go back and you find the original and watch her dance, it's like a whole different experience. It's a whole amazing thing watching her dance as she sings her song.
Yeah. Again, it's artistic interpretation, right? There's an
Yeah.
emotion there. There's a message there. There's something that person wants to convey, whether that's through movement, whether it's through lyrics or music. Lyrics you could call poetry. Uh, and again, I know that kind of puts on the rose-colored glasses, right? When we get into this
Right.
stuff, hey, we're supposed to be tough guys who weld and bang things around and pull splinters out of our fingers with. but I think even the art of woodwork. I mean, just holy cow, sometimes you can sit in your shop in complete silence, and the only thing you hear is the shush of the tool against the wood, cutting ribbons or whatever that you're doing, and the catharsis that we gain from doing that, I think is a pretty awesome thing.
Yeah. And then you're instantly snapped back to reality when the air compressor starts up and startles you.
Isn't that the worst?
Yeah.
Yeah, where somebody slams the door. What the hell are you doing? Uh, well,
Yeah.
Brian, I'm looking at the time. We've been on here, I think, a little bit over an hour today. I think this was a great exploration. This was a really fun topic to talk about. Hopefully, the folks out there listening got a little bit of value out of what we were talking about today.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
cool. Thanks everybody for joining us. I am Greg Porter. You can find my social media at Greg's Garage KC and Skyscraper Guitars.
And I'm Brian Benham, and you can find links to all my socials at brianbenham.com. And you are listening to the Maker's Quest podcast. If you want to check out past episodes, check out the makersquest.com. Thanks for listening.